AITA for refusing to split the house I inherited after reading my grandfather's sealed note? I'm Emily, 37, and in my family I was always the easy daughter. Not the favorite one exactly. More like the one nobody checked on because I usually figured things out before anyone had to ask. My younger sister Rachel is 33, and if something went wrong for her, there was a family meeting. If something went wrong for me, Mom usually said, "You'll handle it." For a long time I took that as confidence. My grandfather Henry died at 82. He was my dad George's father, and he had one rental house that he'd owned for years, plus some cash, investments, personal property, and the usual accounts that had to be sorted through after someone dies. The house wasn't some fantasy inheritance where I got handed keys to a free mansion. It had a tenant, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and a list of things Grandpa had been putting off because he considered anything still technically working to be good enough. But it was valuable and everybody knew it. I'd been helping him with the practical side of it for the last few years of his life. I called plumbers when the tenant reported a leak. I read insurance renewals because Grandpa hated the wording. I checked whether rent had come in when he couldn't remember if he'd looked. I helped organize repair invoices and drove him to a few appointments when he stopped liking highway traffic. I was not his full-time caregiver. I did not sacrifice my entire life for him. Sometimes I got irritated when he called me 3 times about the same contractor estimate. Sometimes I let his calls go to voicemail because I knew quick question meant 40 minutes. And he never once promised me the house. I never asked for it. That matters because after he died, my family started describing my proximity to him like I had spent those years running an inheritance campaign. The estate summary was the first time I learned he had left the rental house to me. Rachel got cash and investment assets, along with some other property, but the value was noticeably less than the appraised value of the house. She didn't explode when we heard it. She just stared at the paperwork and said, "That's it." I remember looking at her because I genuinely didn't know what she meant. Afterward, she asked me in the parking lot, "Did you know?" "No." "Did he ever tell you he was doing this?" "No." "Did he ever tell you why?" "No." She looked at me for a second too long. Then she said, "You were around him a lot." That was the first moment I understood where this might go. I told her, I was around him because he didn't want to call the insurance company himself. That's not the same thing. She said she wasn't accusing me of anything. She was just not directly yet. A few days later, Mom asked Rachel and me to come over. Dad was there too, sitting at the kitchen table with the expression he gets when he hopes everybody else will resolve a problem before he has to take a position. Mom started with, "Your grandfather loved you both the same." I said, "Okay. So whatever the paperwork says, I think we should start from that." That sentence bothered me because she had said something similar right after the funeral, before I had even mentioned the unequal division. At the time she put a hand on my arm and said, "Whatever the paperwork says, you know he loved you equally." I had thought it was just grief talking. Now I wondered why she had been preparing that argument before anyone else was making one. Rachel's proposal was that I either sell the rental house and split the proceeds with her, or keep it and pay her an amount equal to roughly half the equity. I asked, "Half the equity based on what?" "The appraisal." "And where am I supposed to get that amount?" "You own a house now." I almost laughed, but she was serious. Mom said, "You could finance it. Or sell. The point is that family property should stay fair." I said I wasn't making any decision until the estate accounting was farther along, and I understood why Grandpa had written the will the way he had. Mom's face tightened. "Emily, don't hide behind paperwork. It's literally a will. You know what I mean." "No, I don't." Rachel said, "You got the one thing that keeps making money." That part was true. The house produced rent. It also produced bills, but I understood why it felt different to her than a cash account that would only go down once distributed. I said, "I didn't ask him for the house." Mom said, "But you're choosing to keep the benefit." I told her there was a difference between accepting what Grandpa left me and rewriting his estate because she didn't like the result. That was when she called me greedy. Not screaming. Not dramatically. Almost disappointed. "I did not raise you to be this greedy with your own sister." I remember sitting back and thinking how quickly I had gone from the daughter who never needed anything to the daughter who apparently wanted too much. Miles, Grandpa's estate attorney, had already mentioned there was a letter of explanation Henry had instructed him to keep with the estate planning file. I hadn't seen it yet, so I said, "I'll discuss a buyout after I know why Grandpa changed the plan." Miles said, "There's a letter. If you both think this is so obviously unfair, then we can start with what Grandpa actually wrote." Rachel looked at Mom. Mom looked down at the table. It was small, but I noticed. Before all of this, Rachel and I had actually been close. I need to say that because otherwise she sounds like a sister I had resented my entire life, and that isn't true. When we were younger, she called me with things she didn't want to tell our parents. A past due bill. A fight with her husband before the marriage fell apart. A credit card she had let get higher than she'd intended. I once loaned her $4,000. She paid it all back, but it took almost 3 years. She had also shown up for me. During one rough stretch in my own family life, Rachel came over constantly. She watched my kid for a few weekends when I needed time to deal with things. She brought food without turning it into a performance. She was funny when I badly needed someone to be funny. So no, I did not think of Rachel as a parasite. What wore me down was the system around her. Rachel would have a problem and Mom would call Dad, Grandpa, me, maybe Aunt Frances. There would be numbers, plans, transfers, who could cover what, who could drive where, who could talk to whom. If I had a problem, Mom's response was usually, "You'll figure it out." And I usually did. Grandpa Henry was the first person who ever seemed to notice there might be a downside to that. He was extremely particular about money. He had a blue hardcover notebook where he wrote down almost everything. Repairs, loans, gifts, dates, amounts. Sometimes no explanation beyond 2 or 3 words. We used to make fun of him for it. Once he wrote down that Dad owed him $11 for lunch because Dad had forgotten his wallet. Dad said, "You're going to invoice me for a sandwich?" Grandpa said, "If it matters, write it down." Dad gave him $11 just to stop hearing about it. The blue notebook became a family joke. Rachel once said Grandpa probably recorded the price of birthday cake slices. At the time, it seemed like one of those personality quirks you tolerate because the person is old and has always been that way. About a year and a half before Grandpa died, we had dinner for his 81st birthday. Nothing elaborate. Family, food, cake, people talking over each other. Rachel seemed tense that night. I remember because she kept checking her phone and barely ate. She and Grandpa had a private conversation after dinner in his back room. I did not hear the whole thing. What I saw was Rachel go in looking nervous and come out looking angry. I asked, "You okay?" She said, "Grandpa's getting weird about money." I assumed they had argued about some small thing. Grandpa could turn a $50 issue into a principle of civilization if he was in the mood. I didn't ask more. A few weeks later, I was at his house helping him sort insurance paperwork when he asked me something that seemed random. "Do you ever get tired of everybody assuming you'll land on your feet?" I looked at him and said, "Are you worried I'm about to fall down?" He didn't laugh. He said, "I'm serious." So I gave him a half-serious answer. "Sometimes." He nodded and went back to the papers. Then he said, "Being okay can become a way people stop looking at you." I remember that line because it was unusually emotional for him. Grandpa was more likely to communicate affection by replacing a dead battery than by discussing feelings. I told him, "You're getting philosophical." He said, "Don't spread it around." That was it. He never said anything about his will. Around that same period, Mom once told me not to mention that Grandpa had helped Rachel with a down payment years earlier. We were talking about something completely different, and I said Rachel had received help buying a place while I hadn't. I wasn't even arguing. I was making a factual comparison. Mom immediately said, "That was years ago. Don't keep score." I remember being annoyed enough to say, "Tell Grandpa that." She did not find that funny. When Grandpa died about 18 months after his 81st birthday, grief flattened everything for a while. The family had things to do. His house had to be gone through. The rental property still had a tenant who needed a functioning point of contact. Bills didn't stop arriving because everybody was sad. Then the estate division became clear, and grief turned into math. It got worse when the family version of the story started spreading. Aunt Frances called me one afternoon and said, "I'm just going to ask you directly, did you help Dad change his paperwork?" I said, "What does that mean?" "You were helping him with documents. Insurance documents, repair bills, rental stuff." She paused. Then she said, "Linda said he changed things after you started handling more for him." There it was. Not Emily manipulated him. Just a carefully shaped sequence of facts. Emily was around Grandpa more. Emily handled paperwork. Grandpa changed the will. People could build the accusation themselves. I asked Frances, "Do you think I convinced him to leave me the house?" She said, "I think the split is surprising." That wasn't my question. She sighed and said, "I think you should probably be the bigger person and find a compromise." That phrase, "be the bigger person," has always amazed me because somehow the bigger person is usually the one being asked to give up something. I told her I wasn't agreeing to anything until I had more information. Then I called Miles. I didn't ask him to solve the family drama. I asked what he could tell me about the timing and process. He was very clear. "Henry requested the change," he said. "Did I have anything to do with the appointment?" "Not according to my file." "Was there any concern about his capacity?" "No." "Did he tell you why he wanted to change it?" "My notes reflect his reasons at a high level. The decision was his." He explained that Grandpa had contacted him around 18 months before his death to review the estate plan and specifically wanted to account for substantial lifetime assistance. Miles did not have some perfect transcript of every meeting. He had professional notes, dates, documents, and the fact that Grandpa had asked for a letter of explanation to be retained with the estate file. "The letter explains intent," he told me. "The financial records are separate." That distinction ended up mattering. When I read the letter privately, I did not feel victorious. I felt sick. Grandpa wrote like he spoke. Direct, organized, not much decoration. He explained that he was not trying to punish Rachel, and did not consider her less loved. He wrote that over the previous years he had provided her with significant financial assistance during several periods of difficulty, and that he no longer believed it made sense to ignore those transfers when deciding how to divide what remained. Then he described what happened after his 81st birthday. Rachel had asked him to guarantee a $72,000 debt restructuring. She had not asked him to hand her $72,000. That part is important. She wanted him to sign as guarantor because his name and assets would help her get better terms. Grandpa refused. According to the letter, Mom called him the next day and told him he was punishing Rachel for struggling. Then Grandpa wrote the sentence I still remember word for word. "Linda told me Emily will be fine without my help because Emily never needs help." He said that sentence made him realize he had participated in a pattern where my stability was treated as a reason to give me less, while Rachel's difficulties automatically created a claim on more. He wrote that he wanted his estate plan to account for what he had already given both of us, not just what was left on the day he died. I had to stop reading for a while after that. Not because I thought Grandpa had finally declared me the better granddaughter. He hadn't. The letter was explicit that he loved Rachel. What hurt was seeing our family dynamic reduced to one sentence that sounded so familiar. "Emily will be fine." It had always been framed as praise. In that letter it looked different. The estate materials also included Grandpa's blue notebook. That was when the explanation stopped being only an emotional letter. I started seeing Rachel's name. Dates, amounts, short notes. Some I recognized, some I didn't. I did not immediately total them because the notebook wasn't formal accounting. A few lines were vague. Some could have been loans. Some could have been gifts. Some might have been reimbursed. I wasn't going to take an old man's shorthand and turn it into gospel just because it supported me. So I went home and did nothing that night. I did not call Rachel. I did not call Mom. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about 8 years of family emergencies. I remembered the down payment. I remembered Rachel's divorce and the way Mom had said Grandpa was helping her get stable again. I remembered the project Rachel had tried to save after putting too much of her own money into it. I remembered one Christmas when Rachel said she was finally out from under everything, and Grandpa had gotten unusually quiet. There were things in the notebook I had never heard about at all. As the estate accounting moved forward, the larger transfers started matching bank records. $24,000 toward a down payment. $18,500 connected to debt and expenses after Rachel's divorce. $31,000 that went into the project that eventually failed. $20,000 used during another debt restructuring period. Then smaller transfers around those, some clearly documented, some less clear. The confirmed total of substantial assistance to Rachel came to about $108,400 over roughly 8 years. The comparable significant help to me during the same period was about $12,000, mostly one major car repair and money Grandpa gave me when I got married. I knew the difference was large. I had never realized how large. Dad hadn't either. When he first heard the number, he actually said, "That can't be right." He thought Grandpa had helped Rachel maybe $20,000 or $30,000 total. When he saw where the larger amounts came from, he just sat there. Then he said, "I thought I was arguing about one house. Apparently I was arguing about 8 years I never added up." That was the first time he stopped automatically backing Mom's position. But before that shift fully happened, I talked to Rachel. I asked her to meet privately because I did not want our first real conversation about the numbers to happen with Mom translating both of us. I showed her the confirmed transfers, not every vague notebook entry. Rachel did not deny most of them. She looked at the list for a long time and said, "Those were gifts." "I know." "No, I mean Grandpa never said, 'Here's $24,000, but I'm taking it out of your inheritance later.' He never said that." "I know." "So how is that fair?" That was the first point she made that I thought was genuinely hard to answer. I said, "I think he should have told you if that's how he was thinking about it." She looked surprised. "You do?" "Yes." "But you're still keeping the house." "Yes." She laughed once without humor. "Convenient. I'm not saying he handled every part of this perfectly. I'm saying I'm not rewriting his will after he died. He kept a ledger of every time I was falling apart. And everyone kept a mental ledger of every time I didn't." She looked away. I regretted saying it as soon as it came out because it was sharper than I meant. Rachel's financial problems were not one long 8-year scam. Her marriage had ended badly. She had made some expensive decisions. She had taken a risk on a project that failed. Debt piled up. Each event had felt separate while it was happening. She said, "Do you know what that list feels like to look at?" I said, "Probably awful. It looks like a report card." "I know. You get a house because you were good, and I get deductions because I needed help. That's not what I think happened. It's what it feels like." I understood that. Then I asked the question that changed the direction of everything. "Why did you think Grandpa always intended to give us equal shares?" Rachel looked confused. "Because he did." "How do you know?" "Mom told me." I felt my stomach drop. "What exactly did Mom tell you?" "That Grandpa always meant to even it out between us. That he changed after you started handling more of his stuff." There it was, finally stated clearly. I said, "Rachel, I did not know he changed the will." "I know you say that." "No. Listen to me. Miles has the timeline. Grandpa called him. Grandpa requested the change. I wasn't in the meeting. I didn't make the appointment." She said, "You were there all the time." "I was not there all the time. You know what I mean." I said, "If you think I manipulated him, say exactly what you think I did." She got quiet. She didn't have an answer because, as far as I could tell, nobody had given her an actual action to accuse me of. They had given her proximity and suspicion. When I confronted Mom, she shifted immediately. She did not say I had forged anything or pressured Grandpa directly. She said, "Your grandfather got rigid about money when he got older. He had been rigid about money since before I was born. You reinforced it." "How?" "You helped him organize everything. You were always talking about bills and repairs and records." "Because he asked me to." And Rachel wasn't there to explain herself. I stared at her. "Explain what?" "Her bank transfers." Mom said, "You know your sister has had a harder road." That sentence was the center of her entire worldview. Rachel needed more because Rachel had struggled more. I could handle more because I had always handled more. The part Mom could not see was that once you make that your permanent system, the stable person never gets to stop paying the tax for being stable. I asked, "Did you know Grandpa was counting lifetime help when he changed the will?" She said, "He was keeping score." That wasn't my question. She stood up and started clearing things off the counter even though there was nothing to clear. I asked again, "Did you know?" She said, "I knew he was upset." About what? About being asked for money. He wasn't asked for money. Rachel asked him to guarantee debt. You know what I mean. That was becoming everybody's favorite phrase. A few days later Dad called me directly. That almost never happened for family disputes. Usually Mom spoke for both of them. He said, "I didn't know the number was that high." I said, "Neither did I. That's not what I was told." "By who?" He sighed. "Your mother knows the numbers better than I do." I said, "That is exactly how we got here." He didn't argue. Aunt Frances also started backing away from the just split it position after the transfers became clearer. She remembered driving Grandpa to the bank for one of the larger transactions years earlier. At the time she had known he was helping Rachel but not the full context. "I knew about that one," she told me. "I didn't know there were several." "So do you still think I should just give her half?" Frances said. "I think your mother left out quite a bit." It was not full support, but it was the first time she acknowledged that the family story might have been built on missing information. The second twist came because Dad finally asked Mom the question I had been asking. Not whether she knew Grandpa had helped Rachel. Whether she knew he intended to factor that help into the estate plan. Apparently Grandpa had sent Mom a written summary of the major assistance before the revised will was finalized. He had told her he was no longer willing to pretend those transfers didn't count, just because they happened while he was alive. Mom disagreed with him. Strongly. But she knew. She knew before he signed the revised estate documents. Dad told me this after he and Mom had a long argument. I went over and asked her myself because I wanted to hear it from her. Rachel was there too. I said, "Did Grandpa send you the accounting before he changed the will?" Mom said, "A version of it." Rachel turned toward her. "You knew." Mom said, "I didn't agree with how he was looking at it." I said, "You didn't have to agree. You just had to stop telling people I caused it." "I never told anyone you caused it." Rachel said, "You told me he changed after Emily started handling his paperwork." "That is true. It was also true that you knew why he changed it." Mom looked at her and said, "I was trying to keep you from feeling like your grandfather was judging you for every hard year you had." Rachel said, "So you let me think Emily did it?" "I did not make you think anything." That was the moment Rachel turned on Mom. Not screaming, just hurt. "You absolutely did." Mom kept trying to explain that she had wanted to preserve the relationship between us. Her reasoning, once she finally said it plainly, was that if Rachel knew Grandpa had counted the financial help, she would feel humiliated and unloved. Mom thought the cleanest solution was for me to voluntarily redistribute the estate so everyone could leave the past alone. She actually said, "You could end this without anyone else getting hurt." I said, "With my property. With family property." "It's not family property anymore. He left it to me." Mom looked shocked at how cold that sounded. Honestly, I did too. But I was tired of her treating the house like a communal correction fund. The house had been appraised through the estate. It had a tenant. Taxes and insurance continued while probate moved along. Maintenance didn't pause. I had already dealt with one service issue and a renewal notice before the property was even fully transferred. Rachel kept talking as if I had been given a liquid pile of money I could divide with a calculator. Mom's next move was a family compromise. She proposed I keep the house but pay Rachel a large amount that was less than half the equity. In Mom's mind, that was evidence she was being reasonable. I asked for the proposal in writing. She stared at me. "Why?" "Because if we're talking about a large financial transaction, I want to know exactly what you're proposing." Rachel said, "You're making this sound like a business deal." It is a financial deal. Mom said, this is your sister. I know. I also said any buyout proposal would have to identify the amount, how it was calculated, what Rachel would be giving up in exchange, and whether it was supposed to resolve all future claims or arguments. Mom said I was being clinical. I said, I'm not changing his will because you don't like the math. That ended the conversation for the day. I refused the compromise. Rachel accused me of hiding behind Grandpa. Maybe there was some truth in that. A will is, in a way, the dead person making the final call so the living don't have to. But I also knew what would happen if I agreed just to stop the pressure. The story would become that Mom had been right to apply pressure, Rachel had been right to demand, and I had been wrong to resist. And the actual reason Grandpa changed his plan would disappear again. The family meeting happened a few weeks later. Mom framed it as a chance to clear the air. Francis was there, Dad was there, Rachel was there, and a couple of relatives who had already heard enough versions of the story to have opinions were there too. I almost didn't go. Miles had been clear that Grandpa's letter was meant to explain his intent if there was a dispute. Grandpa had not written, read this aloud to the family. I had already shown relevant parts privately to Rachel. I had told Mom what was in it. I could have stopped there. That is the part of this story where I know my hands are not completely clean. I went because Mom was still telling people some version of Henry changed after Emily started handling things. And I was tired of being expected to protect everyone else's privacy, while my own reputation was treated like communal property. At the meeting, Mom started calmly. She said nobody was accusing anybody of a crime. She said the goal was fairness. She said Grandpa had become more rigid in his final years, and that certain influences had shaped how he saw Rachel's finances. I asked, what influences? She said, Emily, don't turn this into an interrogation. No. You keep saying this. What exactly did I do? She said, you were there. You organized his paperwork. You discussed money with him. I discussed his bills with him. Rachel said, you had access to insurance renewals and repair receipts. Mom said, this is what I mean. You're acting like none of your presence mattered. I told her, if you keep saying I influenced him, I'm going to answer it. Mom said, then answer it. So I did. I had brought a copy of the relevant portion of the letter. I did not read sections that touched on private details of Rachel's marriage or other things that had nothing to do with the estate decision. I read the section about the $72,000 debt guarantee request. I read that Grandpa had refused. I read that Mom called him afterward and said Rachel needed him more than I did. And I read the part where Grandpa said he had realized the family had turned my ability to cope into a reason to keep allocating more support away from me. Then I read the section explaining that he wanted his estate plan to consider substantial lifetime assistance, and I gave the confirmed total from the estate accounting. $108,400 to Rachel. About $12,000 to me. Nobody applauded. Nobody gasped theatrically. Mostly people looked uncomfortable, because hearing private financial history summarized in a family room is uncomfortable. Rachel's face went red. That's the image I still feel bad about. She said, so this is what we're doing now? Reading out every time I needed help. I said, I'm reading why he changed the will because Mom keeps telling people I changed it. Rachel said, he kept score of every time I was falling apart. I said more quietly this time, I know. He never told me those gifts were advances. I know. If he wanted them counted, why didn't he tell me? I think he should have. That changed the energy a little because I wasn't trying to defend every decision Grandpa made. Rachel looked at me like she had expected me to say Grandpa was perfectly right. I said, I understand why that feels unfair. What I don't accept is making me responsible for fixing it with something he left to me. Mom said, nobody is making you responsible. I looked at her. You called me greedy because I wouldn't refinance a house to pay Rachel. She said, I was trying to keep you girls together. Dad spoke up. Linda, when did you know? Mom said, George. When did you know Henry was counting the help? She did not answer right away. Dad asked again. Before he signed the new will? Mom finally said, yes. Rachel closed her eyes. Francis said, Then this isn't about Emily influencing him. Mom said. I never said she manipulated him. Frances replied. You didn't have to use the word. That was the power shift. Not because everybody suddenly agreed Grandpa had been fair. They didn't. Not because Rachel suddenly stopped being hurt. She didn't. It changed because the central accusation against me no longer survived the timeline. Grandpa had documented years of assistance. He had refused the $72,000 guarantee. Mom had argued with him. Grandpa had asked Miles to revise the estate plan. Grandpa had sent Mom the accounting. Mom had known his reasoning before the revised will was signed. There was no missing scene where I secretly convinced him to cut Rachel out. In fact, Rachel had not been cut out. She still inherited real assets. Dad looked at Mom and said, I should have asked more questions before I took a side. Mom started crying, but not in a manipulative way. I think she genuinely believed she had been trying to prevent something worse. She said she had spent years helping Rachel because Rachel needed more help, not because she loved me less. I believed her. That was what made it complicated. Mom said, I never wanted either of you to feel less loved. Rachel said, then why did you let me think Emily did this? Mom said, because I knew what you would hear if I told you the truth. You would hear that your grandfather thought you were a failure. Rachel said, so instead I got to think my sister stole from me. Mom flinched. That was the first time I saw her understand the trade she had actually made. She had tried to protect Rachel from shame by moving the blame onto me. After that meeting, the house issue was basically over for me. I told Rachel and Mom I was not selling it to divide the proceeds, and I was not buying Rachel out of a share she had never legally owned. I didn't inherit a vote, I said. I inherited a house. Rachel told me that sounded smug. She was right. It did. I was angry, and sometimes when I'm angry I get colder instead of louder. That can feel controlled from the inside while still landing like punishment on everyone else. So I stopped talking before I made it worse. I did make one concession that felt right to me. Grandpa's will allowed Rachel and me to divide certain sentimental items by agreement. I told her I would not use the house dispute to claim those too. If there were things of his she cared about, we could work them out separately. She said she wanted his old watch, some photos, and a small wooden box he kept on his dresser. I didn't object. The fallout was not neat. Rachel and I barely spoke for a few months. Mom and I spoke, but with limits. I stopped letting her act as a messenger between Rachel and me. If Rachel wanted something from me, Rachel could ask me. If Mom had an opinion, it was Mom's opinion, not what the family thinks. Dad apologized. Not dramatically. He called and said, I should have asked more questions before I took a side. I said, yes. He laughed a little and said, you could make that easier on me. I said, I could. Then I told him I appreciated the apology. He stayed with Mom, obviously. Their marriage did not collapse over one estate fight. But he stopped saying, your mother knows the numbers better than I do. Whenever money came up between the family, he started calling each of us directly. Frances never fully endorsed what I had done. She told me, I think your mother left out quite a bit. I also think reading that letter in front of everyone was a choice. I said, I know. She said, both things can be true. Think she was right. There were relatives who still thought I should have paid Rachel something just to keep the family together. A couple of them used the phrase, it's only money, which is very easy to say when the money is someone else's property. I stopped arguing. The estate process took time. The rental house continued to have expenses. Once it transferred fully to me, I kept renting it. I did not sell it to prove a point. I did not raise the rent just because I could. I did not move into it. It stayed what it had already been. A rental property that needed insurance renewals, repairs, tax payments, and occasional calls at inconvenient times. There was something almost calming about that. The object at the center of the family drama became boring again. A house. Not a symbol. Not a referendum on which sister was loved more. Just a house. Eventually Rachel texted me. Not an apology. She wrote, I still think Grandpa was wrong to count gifts no one told me were advances. I stared at the message for a while. Months earlier, I might have answered with a paragraph defending Grandpa. Instead I wrote, "I think he should have told you that too." She replied, "So you admit that part was messed up?" I wrote, "Yeah, I think he should have told you." That was the first conversation we had where neither of us was trying to win the entire history of the family. She still thought Grandpa had turned love into accounting. I still thought she had been wrong to demand that I erase his decision after he died. Both things stayed true. A little later, when we were sorting the remaining sentimental items, we disagreed about a few things. Normally I would have said, "It's fine. Let her choose," remembered the resentment, and then gotten angry 3 months later about something that looked unrelated. That was my pattern. This time I found an old index card in one of Grandpa's drawers. His handwriting said, "If it matters, write it down." I laughed when I saw it. I used to think that sentence summed up one of his most annoying traits. Maybe it still did. I took a sheet of paper and listed the items Rachel wanted, the ones I wanted, and the few we needed to decide together. I sent her a photo before either of us took anything. She texted back, "Grandpa would be annoyingly proud of you." I wrote, "Don't tell him." She sent a laughing emoji. That did not repair everything. We were not suddenly best friends again. Mom and I did not go back to pretending she had merely misunderstood something. Rachel never said Grandpa had been right, and I never decided he had handled it perfectly. But she stopped saying I manipulated him. And the next time Mom asked if I could just be okay with letting the whole thing go so the family could get back to normal, I didn't tell her I'd be fine. I said, "I'll decide what I'm okay with." Then I went home, checked the rental account, scheduled a repair and wrote it down. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.